my name is Michelle Lee, and I'll be presenting an analytical IOP on the motifs used by Stephen King in his novel, The Green Mile. So my thesis statement. I plan on analyzing and interpreting the 4 motifs that Stephen King uses in his novel, The Green Mile, and I'll be discussing the biblical and literary significance and references that he uses, as well as using text from the evidence to support my points made. So the 4 motifs that I will be discussing today are the number 3, the fairytale imagery motif, the left or right motif, and finally, the death motif. So in this case, the 3 executions that occurred throughout the course of the novel. My first motif is the number 3. So here's some background information on the number 3. A lot of this is biblical references of the number 3. You see that this number is used many, many times in the Christian Bible. It comes in many different shapes and forms, as well as the number of people, so 3 righteous patriarchs before the flood. And then it pictures completeness, and we see this by the number of books in the New Testament, which is 27, also known as 3 to the 3rd power. And finally, it also plays as a time interval of 3 for the times that Jesus prayed before his arrest. And it's also used similarly in The Green Mile. Specific words in The Green Mile are repeated 3 times consecutively. There are also many time intervals of 3, and we see this with Mr. Jingles and John Coffey and Delacroix as well. And then many times the characters are presented in 3s, and you also see this in the film adaptation of the novel, where the 3 guards are constantly being framed by 3, and there's 3 shots of that. And this creates bridges between The Green Mile and the Bible, and we get to see those connections being made as I go through. So here's some textual evidence of the number 3. You can see that it comes in 3 children, so Dedric's 3 children. The guards are again presented in 3 during Bitterbuck's execution rehearsal, and another time interval of 3 during his execution rehearsal. Mr. Jingles also follows the rule of 3 in time intervals. After Percy chases him down the mile, he comes back 3 days later. The mouse, Mr. Jingles, stops 3 feet before the duty desk. And finally, during Coffey's execution, there's 3 lights that blow out, and it also mentions the sound pow, pow, pow. Pow used 3 times. There are also 3 miracles that John Coffey performs throughout the novel. The first miracle was when he healed Paul's urinary tract infection. The second miracle was when he saved Mr. Jingles' life after Percy squashed him with a shoe. And finally, the third miracle was when he saved Hal Moore's wife, Melinda, by healing her brain tumor and taking away her cancer. And John Coffey's 3 miracles, they go from something as tiny as a urinary infection to something larger, like the life of a little creature. And finally, he goes and saves a human life. So each miracle gets stronger and stronger, and it gets put on a larger scale. And each miracle includes him using his hands, holding the thing that he is healing, or the person that he is healing. And finally, he exhales black flies, which in the novel turns into white flies. And this also creates another bridge between The Green Mile and the Bible. We see the connection between John Coffey and God, where God takes away our sins and John Coffey takes away our pain and suffering. The second motif that I will be discussing today is the fairytale imagery that Stephen King uses throughout the novel. We see this by the way that he presents John Coffey. King provides his dynamic work, especially presenting his characters through imagery and metaphor. And John Coffey is very large, so he is often described as a giant. And these are images from the film that depict how large he is compared to the guards. They're also framed by 3. And here's some textual evidence. You can see that he's directly called a giant in a fairy tale. And then the Dedrick girls, twins, are described as dolls in the arms of a giant, of John Coffey. And even little Delacroix, the little Frenchman, is described as a little Frenchman next to a black giant, who is John Coffey. The next character that I'll be discussing fairytale imagery with is the mouse. The first thing that you notice about Mr. Jingles is he is extremely intelligent. And we see this by the way he eats a sandwich, and the guards are amazed by the way he eats it. More like a human, even more like not like a mouse, and definitely not like an animal. And finally, next, he is Delacroix's pet. But he's more than a pet, he's more like a friend. And in the end, before Delacroix is executed, Mr. Jingles is all he has left, and that's all he has hope in. And Mr. Jingles is also affected by John Coffey's magic when he is brought back to life after Percy killed him. And he's also proof of Coffey's magic because he lives so long. He lives to 60 years of age, and finally dies at the end of the novel. But 60 years is much longer than a mouse should live. So here's textual evidence of when he's first introduced. The way he ate fascinated the guards. The splinters of wood that he kept from Delacroix reminded Paul of jackstraws for elves, which is another example of fairytale imagery used. And he's often described to have little oil-drop eyes, which is a biblical reference. He's seen as a holy spirit or a holy character. Here's some more textual evidence of Mr. Jingles. So here Mr. Jingles is compared to the guards, but the guards are now called giants in blue because of their uniform. Again, we see oil-drop eyes. And one thing that I found interesting about Mr. Jingles is he also followed the Rule of 3 many times, and throughout the Green Mile novel, he had 3 names: Steamboat Willie, Mr. Jingles, and the Mouse on the Mile. The third motif I'll be discussing today is the left or right motif. So left, on the T-junction of E block, when you turn left, it represents life because it's the opposite direction of Old Sparky, the electric chair. And it says in the text that a left turn meant life, which is towards the exercise yard. And I chose to put a picture of Paul because he lives the longest and he outlives all the characters, all the guards. He outlives Mr. Jingles, and finally he even outlives Elaine, a special friend he made at the nursery home that he's at. So he lives very long, and in the end of the novel he's still living, and they don't even tell us when he passes away. On the right represents death, because on the T-junction of E block, when you turn right, you see Old Sparky. And he's also connotated with terror because of the prisoners. They're sitting there with their last few minutes of life, and it's horrifying. So again, on the right is death, which is Old Sparky, his own self. And here are some more left and right references in the text. We see it's used many times in very simple ways, but it's there. So just the way John Coffey shakes his head. He goes once to the left, once to the right, and then dead back into the center. And then there is Mr. Jingles and Delacroix, how Mr. Jingles interacts with Delacroix. Delacroix taught Mr. Jingles a trick where he is on his right hand and he crawls over to his left shoulder, so going from death to life. And then there's the gurney holding Bitterbuck's dead body while going down the tunnel. And we see the shadow waxing and waning, so going left and right again. And finally, there is the death motif, which is the fourth motif that I'll be talking about. I'll be going over the 3 executions that occurred throughout the course of the novel. So the first execution that occurs in part 2 of the novel, and it's of Arlen Bitterbuck. Arlen Bitterbuck was convicted of killing a man while he was drunk by crushing his head with a cement block, and the man that he killed was also drunk. His date of execution was on July 17th on a rainy summer's day. And you also notice that the little tiny motif that's used in this is the weather during these executions. It's usually harsh, rainy, never sunny. And Mr. Jingles was watching his execution rehearsal, and in the text they mentioned he had his oil drop eyes again. So here's some more textual evidence of Arlen's rehearsal execution and the actual execution itself. We see that the guards again are introduced by 3, so it's Dean, Harry, and Paul, and another time interval of 3. And then this is the statement that they state right before they say roll on 2, and there's a line in here that said, may God have mercy on your soul, which is another biblical aspect of his execution. We have the execution of Eduard Delacroix. And on the first day that Edward was introduced to us, he was beat by Percy by his baton, and later the damage was described to have bruises from Christmas to Easter, which is a beginning of something and the end of something, and it's also religious. He was convicted of raping a girl, and then he tried to hide the remains by burning her body and ended up catching an entire building on fire, killing 6 more people, 2 of them of which were children. And he had his acquaintance, Mr. Jingle, who was everything he had left by the end of the novel, and his execution went horribly wrong. because Percy did not wet the sponge, and the sponge is what conducts electricity straight from the cap to the brain to make it quick and subtle, and his execution ended up being very painful and dragged out for much longer than it should have. And here's some textual evidence from his execution. We can see that the heavens had protested the bad death of Eduard Delacroix with the weather being thundering and stormy. In his last words, he mentioned "turn back the clock," which I thought was interesting because he referenced time. And thunder again. There were 3 thunder strikes. The third one was the loudest, which was right before Percy said "roll on 2," which is the final strike, the final message that Paul should have caught, but he didn't, and it was too late. And this was the quote of Paul when he finally realized that the sponge was dry, however it was too late. There was a saying that Percy said because he was running the whole joint. And finally, during Delacroix's execution in the chair, he was described for his body to be jittering and twisting side to side, up and down, which is another reference to left and right motif, because throughout the whole execution he was half alive and dying a painful death at the same time. And again, once the execution started, the thunder banged louder and the rain started to pour down harder, so the weather got worse and worse, and also reflected the bad execution. Finally, there's the execution of John Coffey. John Coffey is often mentioned as the giant on the mile because of his appearance, and he has a very deceiving appearance because you see this big man who's convicted of killing 2 little girls. He's large, and then one of the first questions he asked to Paul was, "Do you keep the light on at night?" because he's afraid of the dark, which is something that children are usually afraid of and adults aren't. And then later we find out that he was falsely convicted of killing the twin Detroit girls. And then we are often hearing that he's a gift of God because of his ability to heal, and we see this through the 3 miracles that he performs throughout the novel. And finally, John Coffey was Paul's last execution. And here on the side, I put up pictures of the 3 states that we see John Coffey in, and these are from the film. The first state that we usually see him in is in his fearful state, because he's afraid of the dark, and the dark usually represents the unknown. The second state that we see him in is in his innocent state, because he has this very childlike aspect to him, or very innocent aspect to him, and he also likes to help people, so he's a good person. And finally, we see him in his holy state, because he's often referenced as a gift of God. And in the film, we see the lights go up behind him like halos of an angel. And here's some textual evidence of John Coffey's execution. This is just when Paul stated that John Coffey was his last execution. During his execution, he was sitting in the chair, getting hooked up. You can see his eyes moving from side to side, and later you see his tongue move from one side of his mouth to the other, again with the left and right motif. And then John Coffey's last words, there were 6 of them, and he says, "I'm sorry for what I am." And then right before Paul puts over the cover, the black cover of his head, John Coffey says, "Don't put me in the dark, don't make me go in the dark, I was afraid of the dark," and he says dark 3 times. And then during the execution, the 3 lights blow out, making a pow 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 sound. And then finally, the last thing that we see of John Coffey, or hear of John Coffey, is the water running down from his face, and it's the salt water from the sponge mixed in with the tears, his last tears.